Today is session 2 of our dismissal masterclasses, and we are talking about capability dismissals today. So in our first session, we did conduct dismissals. Those are available on demand. And today is capability, and this is part of our masterclass series that we are doing on dismissal. And we are going to be joined by a special guest later on in the season when we look at actually how we want to try and retain people and good onboarding so we get a bit of balance. So today we're going to be looking at sickness, performance, and the traps that catch employers out, and a bit of a practical guide for getting it right. So what is the cost of getting it wrong? Why do we need to talk about these things? Well, capability dismissals are some of the most expensive categories to defend. Not only are you at risk of unfair dismissal when it comes to capability dismissals, but also it's one of those key areas where disability discrimination becomes a very real risk. So awards into the hundreds of thousands are not necessarily uncommon when it comes to capability dismissals, particularly when we are looking at things around disability discrimination. And there's so many moving parts when we look at this. We've got to think about our dismissal process. We might be thinking about performance improvement plans that are ongoing. We've probably got a capability process that we need to deal with. We've got the medical evidence side of stuff, as well as actual key performance. So there's a lot going on. So this is a really, really complex area. So there's some statistics on the screen about how serious this can get. So £105,000 award in respect of a failure to consider Section 15 of the Equality Act and reasonable adjustments. We are going to talk about that case in a little bit more detail. 87,000 for a PIP sham. So this is where we've got a PIP that's not a real PIP. It's designed to move somebody out rather than actually trying to improve their performance. And a case where £93,000 was awarded when no medical evidence was sought, and the tribunal found that there was no reasonable basis for the belief that an employee could not return to work. We do know that there is very much a culture around settlement. One, because tribunal can cost a lot of money. Your legal fees, if you are engaged in this sort of case, are not going to be insignificant unless you've got the benefit of insurance. And often when you're facing awards of these sorts of sizes, then it can often be commercial to try and settle. But that doesn't mean that you're not still going to be having to reach into your pocket and paying out lots of money. So the hard truth, capability is harder to get right than conduct because there's so many moving parts. We've got the disability overlay, the consultation requirements, medical evidence burdens, which means that the margin for error is very, very narrow. And tribunals, unfortunately, have very little patience for employers who cut corners, even if they do mean well. So the rules are also changing. So to make it all the more complicated, we've got the Employment Rights Act 2025, which has introduced seismic change to unfair dismissal, and capability claims are in the eye of the storm. These are not hypothetical risks. This is something that we are now facing. So what's changing? So for those of you who've been on sessions with me before, you'll be sick to death of me saying this. Qualifying period is coming down from 2 years to 6 months. So the day one rights aren't actually arriving, but in terms of what we need to be thinking about from day one, those onboarding processes, and making sure that we are ready to be treating employees properly and onboarding them properly from day one are coming, because employees are only going to need 6 months service to claim unfair dismissal, and that will be from January 2027. So anyone who is employed by your business from the 1st of July this year is going to have that protection from the 1st of January 2027. The compensation cap is going to be removed, so currently capped at 115,000. Under the Employment Rights Act 2025, we are seeing that removed. So when we've been able to talk in relatively sort of risk reduction terms around unfair dismissal and saying, well, look, your big risk is disability discrimination because it's uncapped, that's no longer going to be the case. Unfair dismissal is still is going to now be something where we're going to have to sort of wait and see to see how tribunals start to deal with cases where the compensation cap has been lifted. The claim window also being extended, so there is going to be a longer period for people to be able to bring claims. So we are going to be sitting on this risk for a lot longer than previously we have done. So why are capability claims more exposed? Well, conduct dismissals are difficult anyway, but capability cases carry that additional layer of risk because of the Equality Act and that disability overlay. So by the very nature of us dealing with capability, if people are off sick long term, they are more likely to be suffering with a disability, which is why the Act is engaged. So if we have an employee who has incapacity for work or they're underperforming and it's connected to a disability, we're not just defending an unfair dismissal claim, you're also defending discrimination. So an action point that I would suggest is review every live capability case that you have now before January 2027. And if you have anyone on a PIP or anyone on long-term sickness, make sure that you are analysing those cases, that you are going through and thinking, well, where is our risk with this? What is our plan? And what are we going to be doing to make sure that we are keeping our risk low? Is this something we need to be taking advice on, or actually are we stumbling around a little bit in the dark and we're not quite sure where this one's going or what the risk actually looks like? So how exposed is your business to a capability claim? So take a moment, be honest with yourself and have a think about which of these best describes your organization's current position on capability, and have a look at our poll. So how confident are you that your last capability dismissal would stand up to a tribunal? Completely confident, clear capability policy. We've documented everything that we've done. Our process and evidence were solid. Cautious. So these are where you manage your cases as they arise, but your process isn't fully documented and you're not always sure when disability overlays or kicks in, but you're mostly confident. Not confident at all or concerned. So we've had difficult capability situations and not confident we've handled them correctly, or unsure. We don't really have a process. We haven't really done this before. We've never had to think about it in any depth. So this session couldn't come at a better time. So unsurprisingly, I'd say 87% falling into that second category. Complete confidence, I will say, when it comes to capability dismissals is rare, even with employment lawyers and barristers. No one ever has total confidence when it comes to dismissing someone either on long-term sick or where there is an active disability. These are challenging cases, but kudos to you for the level of confidence. Maybe you can come join my team. So interesting to see where this lands on that poll, and that's 12% at the bottom about people we've never really pressure tested it. So hopefully a great session for you guys so that you can understand some of the foundations of what we can do to keep our risk lower. So let's have a look at where we are in the series. So session 1, we've done conduct dismissal. Session 2, this is where we are now. We're doing capability. Session 3, so the next one is going to be redundancy. There is a sign up link in the chat and we will circulate that afterwards. Session 4, we're doing SOSR and statutory dismissals. Session 5, we're going to look at wrongful dismissal notice, and then we're also going to look at onboarding and retention as well. So today's agenda, what does capability actually mean in law? We're going to look at the 3-strand map, the fairness test, ill health process, disability overlay, reasonable adjustment, short-term absence, performance and PIPs, case studies, scenarios, and the golden rules to follow. So not a lot to get through in 20 minutes. As I say, if you want to play this back, then it will be available on YouTube afterwards. So what is a capability dismissal then? Well, under section 98(2) of the Employment Rights Act, capability is one of the 5 potential fair reasons for dismissal. So in the UK, we only have 5 fair reasons why somebody can be dismissed, and we pick 1. So where we've got someone who we want to dismiss for capability, this is by reference to skill, aptitude, health, or other physical or mental qualities. So this covers performance. So someone whose skills are not up to the task, or perhaps they don't have the knowledge, or they've been over-promoted or recruited into the wrong role. So they're not capable of doing the job by nature of the skills and experience that they have. Or because of ill health, that someone is incapable of performing the role that they have. So that could be because of long-term absence, so they're not actually in the workplace. It could be because they're in and they're out because of their ill health, or actually their ill health could be affecting the way that they are performing at work. So they are presenting, they are trying, but they're not able to do the job that they were employed to do. So capability, one of our potential 5 fair reasons, but that is only the starting point. As we went through 2 weeks ago when we did the conduct dismissals, having a fair reason isn't enough. We also have to go through a fair process. So the decision has to be substantively and procedurally fair. So the ACAS Code of Conduct on disability and grievance procedures will apply to capability processes. So we need to make sure that we are going through a fair process to avoid that 25% uplift. So we've got 2 windows here: ill health capabilities. We've got absence, long-term sickness or frequent short-term absences or failure to return to work. And we've got skills and performance. So underperformance, failure to meet standards, and lack of aptitude or application. And the 2 may well interchange. So you could have, as I said, someone who is off on long-term sick, but when they do present for work, that their skills and their performance are below standard. either because they've missed time at work and that we've got some skill fade, or because their illness or condition is affecting their ability to perform whilst they are at work. Now, one of the key things that I would say that you need to remember here is, and it sounds so simple, that when you are thinking about what process we're taking somebody down, is to make sure that we've actually picked the right process, because the lines that often get blurred are between capability and conduct. And where we see this is where we've got people who either have recurring short-term absences, or perhaps they're late to work, or they're not completing full days. And what I'll sometimes see with some of our clients is that they will be trying to take somebody down a disciplinary route rather than a capability route. And tribunals hate it if we don't pick the correct reason when it comes to dismissals. That is falling at the first hurdle. So what we need to remember here is that capability is about someone who can't do something. It's often not intentional. This is someone who is unable to perform. Conduct is where someone won't do something. So they're choosing not to do something, or they are choosing to behave in a poor way despite being warned about their conduct or being made aware of your company rules. So they're two slightly different tests, and the legal risks are very different, not to mention the fact that tribunals expect you to pick the right, fair reason. So making sure that before we launch into a disciplinary process, which is something that I do see quite a lot where we've got short-term absences or people who are late for work because of health, that we need to think, well, what is the core reason here that we are trying to resolve? What is it that we are really looking at? Is it a conduct issue or is it a capability issue? Because if we don't get that right at the start, it can be quite difficult to clean it up later on. So the 3-strand map. So not all capability dismissals are the same. As I said in the introduction, we could be looking at someone who has a disability. We've got long-standing health issues. It could be someone who doesn't have a disability, but they're in and out of work. Or we've got someone where skills, performance, and capability are an issue. So the legal tests, the risk, tribunal scrutiny can all differ slightly depending on what it is that we are looking at. So understanding which strand you are in and where the overlap is very important, because you could have somebody who is not performing because of a lack of core skills or fundamental experience or capability. We put them on a PIP, we try and develop them. During that PIP, they develop stress, anxiety, they go off sick. And as far as we knew that this was a healthy employee, and it triggers long-standing depression. This person then, their absence starts to become significantly longer term than initially expected. So something that started in that skills and performance capability starts to drift into those other elements, and we need to flex how we are dealing with this employee. Shoving that person and continuing down that PIP strand is unlikely to produce a fair dismissal. We need to make sure that we are considering other aspects of the law that are going to be activated once it becomes clear that that person is suffering with their health as well. So ill health, non-disability, we're thinking about consultation, collecting medical evidence. The legal tests I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail later on. These have a moderate legal risk, but the importance here is making sure we engage with that employee, we take them through a fair process, and that we make sure that we get medical evidence. We're not making decisions in a vacuum. Disability-related ill health, this is where we have got the highest legal risk and the uncapped awards because of that disability discrimination risk. And you could be facing a whole host of claims here. So in addition to direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, discrimination where you've got disability arising from, and a failure to make reasonable adjustments. So you could be facing a swathe of claims. And particularly if you've got an unrepresented litigant in person, often they will plead everything. So you could be facing 25, 30, 40 allegations of discrimination before that case gets narrowed. And these cases are very expensive to defend. They often require 2, 3, 4 preliminary hearings to try and nail down exactly what this claim is before it gets to hearing. And the likelihood is you're going to be paying for a solicitor to assist you with this. So it's really, really important that we don't allow those disability-related absences to become toxic. We need to be supporting those employees. We need to be looking at reasonable adjustments. We need to be taking occupational health advice, getting up-to-date medical reports, and keeping that employee engaged. Skills and performance, so we can look at SMART objectives and PIPs, but we do need to be looking at genuine support and training. PIPs should not just be a means of managing someone out of a business, and tribunals can spot the difference between a PIP that is a performance improvement plan that is designed to improve someone's performance versus a plan that is designed for someone to fail so that we can try and manage them out and say that we have tried. It's very, very easy to see through the latter. So it's really, really important that when we are setting PIPs, that we are doing so in a way that is supportive and is designed to gently push someone through development rather than setting goals that are unachievable. We also need to have fair timescales. Like I say, these are lower risk if the process is robust, but it's not unusual for people to start in this third box and drift over towards the others, particularly if they don't feel that they are coping very well with that PIP. They're more likely then to go off on long-term sick. So fairness test for capability, it's not virtual, which is what we touched on 2 weeks ago in the unfair dismissal section when it came to conduct. But it's not wholly dissimilar. So we still have to have a genuine belief that this employee is no longer capable of fulfilling their role, either because of skills or performance or because of ill health. So we have to genuinely believe it. How do we get that genuine belief? Well, we have to do a proper investigation. What that looks like with capability is often medical investigation for somebody who's not very well, or things like PIPs and setting goals and looking at whether people can achieve the targets that are being set where it relates to skills. So we have to have a reasonable basis for that belief. So things like referring to occupational health, getting up-to-date GP records and documenting our performance concerns. We then have to go through a fair process. So the employee has got to be properly consulted. They need to be given the opportunity to respond to concerns and given a chance to improve with support. And they also need to be aware of the consequences. And we need to remember the ACAS Code of Conduct applies all the way through. Now, one of the key sort of temperature checks that I have is if you have somebody who is in a final hearing for capability, dismissal should not be coming as a surprise at that point. If dismissal comes as a surprise, something has gone wrong. They don't realise that it's as serious as the employer believes it to be. They've not been aware of the consequences. They don't realise how bad the situation has got, or they don't think they're as far through the process as actually they are. So this should never come as a surprise. Alternatives have also been considered. So particularly where we have someone who's got the Protection of the Equality Act who is disabled, we need to genuinely consider alternatives. So redeployment, adjusted roles, reasonable adjustments, phased returns, changing duties. Can we give someone a mentor? Can we support them? Have we had conversations with them about actually what they need? Are there other creative things that we can look at? Rather than just marching through a process in the way that it's written, we need to make sure that we have considered every available option before we move to dismiss. And failing to consider alternatives and failing to take that creative approach can often be fatal to a defence. So we also need to think in the terms of the band of reasonable responses, which we discussed 2 weeks ago. So a tribunal will ask, did this employer act within the range of reasonable responses? Was it reasonable at this point to conclude that this person was no longer capable of performing their role? Did they follow a fair process, and did they genuinely try and help this employee before they move to dismiss? So I've got a couple of questions that have popped up here. So 2 months be a fair timescale to improve sales targets? It's a very lawyer answer, I'm afraid. It depends. So it depends on the performance history for this individual. If you've got someone where it's been an issue for quite a while, it could well be that actually 2 months is fine. But where you've got someone who's been a solid performer for say 5-6 years and poor performances come a bit out of the blue, 2 months may well not be long enough. It could well be that you need to do a bit of digging, have a chat with this individual, see what's going on with them. And if there are medical reasons for why the performance isn't improving, 2 months may well not be enough. It depends on the role. It depends on how they've been doing. If that's something you want to go through in a bit more detail, Debbie, I'd be more than happy to have a conversation with you after the session. And then I've got a question from Lana. If someone starts a PIP but then partway through expresses they've got mental health pressures, so at that point I would be expecting that you'll be having a welfare discussion with this employee, and it may well be that we take the decision to extend that PIP, refer them to occupational health. Yes, it's a pressured situation to be putting somebody in. So if you've got someone who's not performing, they're on a PIP, they're aware that their employment could ultimately be terminated if they fail the PIP, that is going to take a mental toll on that person, and it can make them enter a bit of a negative or toxic cycle when it comes towards their well-being. This person is still employed by you. You still have a duty of care towards them. So my suggestion would always be make sure we're weaving in those well-being discussions with them. So we're checking on how they are outside of the process as well. Look at what support we can give them, consider extending the PIP, and make sure that we refer to occupational health as well. So the ill health capability process, this is as a minimum what we should be taking people through if we have someone who doesn't have a disability but is off because of ill health. So early consultation, we'd be looking to hold a welfare or a return to work meeting if they've come back in, and keep in regular supportive contact. We don't go completely silent. There's a bit of a myth that you can't contact people while they're off on sick leave. We can if we are extending invitations to things like process meetings, welfare meetings, and we're checking in to see how they are. Or if we have agreed with them at the start of their sickness absence, or if it's within our policy, that we will keep them updated on company matters whilst they are off. Abandonment of an employee during sickness is in itself a risk. Step 2, medical evidence. So obtain up-to-date GP notes and request an independent occupational health report with specific questions around prognosis, their condition, their role, so that this is really, really tailored so that we can use that later on in the process. It's a real bugbear of mine where I see occupational health reports where we haven't asked specific questions and it just sort of generally describes how an employee is. That isn't going to help us. Step 3, review and consider alternatives. So on receipt of the report, meet with the employee, consider redeployment, adjusted hours, phased return, or temporary cover. Now, legally, if they don't have a disability, you don't have to make reasonable adjustments, but it could transpire later down the line that actually what they're suffering with is a disability. So again, my advice is always do more than you need to do early doors so that you're not going to get caught out later on. Capability hearing, if return remains unlikely after a reasonable period, or they're still in, they're out, then we're going to hold formal capability hearing. Now, dismissal should be a last resort, so it could be that we issue a first attendance warning, and everyone calls these things different things. So it could be informal warning, written warning, final written warning. However it is that you frame them, usually there's around 3 stages to these things. Once we get to the point of final resort, then dismissal. And then we have the appeal stage as well, remembering that we should try and make sure that it's an independent manager who is holding that. So if we have got someone who has a disability, the Equality Act 2010 is your biggest risk. So this is when capability cases become discrimination cases. So if an employee's condition meets the legal definition of disability, so hopefully we all know that. So it's where we've got a physical or a mental condition that has or is likely to last 12 months or more, that has a substantial negative impact on someone's ability to undertake day-to-day activities and activities at work. So conditions that have been found to be disability often include depression, anxiety disorders, so not just day-to-day anxiety or anxiety in response to life events, but actual anxiety disorders have been found to be disabilities. Autism, other neurodiverse conditions, as well as the ones that you would typically expect. So when somebody has something like cancer, motor neuron disease, those sorts of things. But that definition, so something that is long-term, so around 12 months, that has an impact on someone's ability to undertake day-to-day activities, that's what we need to bear in mind. So we've got that legal framework, and the key risks here, when pleaded correctly, is discrimination arising from disability. So when we're treating someone unfavorably because of something that has arisen in consequence of their disability. So say, for example, you've got someone who doesn't sleep very well because of their condition. That means that they struggle to get out of the house in the morning and they are late for work. It's not their disability that's making them late. It's something arising in consequence of it. And if we were to discipline them for that, that could potentially be discrimination arising from disability. And then also the duty to make reasonable adjustments. And often where those are identified, we often identify indirect discrimination as well. So where we have someone who is struggling with a disability, that means that either there's a physical barrier that's an issue at work, or there's a PCP, so a provision, criterion, or practice that affects them worse because they're disabled compared to non-disabled members of staff. We need to be making reasonable adjustments to level that playing field. So key cases that you need to consider. So we've got City of York Council and Grosset and O'Brien and Bolton Street, Catherine Academy. I will circulate some case summaries because we don't have time to get through these in detail. But unfavourable treatment arising from disability does not require the employer to know that the treatment is actually connected to disability. So this is the point I was making earlier about almost treat everybody as though they might be disabled, because there are employers who've been pinged where they have not thought about this early enough, have tried to plead ignorance around knowing whether someone's disabled or not, and they haven't come out of it very well. And then O'Brien and Bolton, St Catherine's Academy, a long-term sickness absence is something arising in consequence of disability, and dismissal for absence is a dismissal because of disability. So a really legalistic way of saying if someone's off because of disability and we dismiss because of that, it is going to trigger that section 15 of the Equality Act, unless we can justify it, which is why those processes are so important. Griffiths and Secretary of State for Work and Pensions. So absence management policies can be provision criteria or practice. So if you've got someone off on long-term sick, we apply our absence management policy. That's a neutral policy that we would apply to everybody. If somebody is off on long-term sick because of disability, they're more likely to be taken through the latter and more serious stages of that policy. As a result, that's a detriment. It's going to trigger reasonable adjustments. Reasonable adjustments can be extending those trigger points or perhaps delaying before we start that formal process. So that's something to think about. And it's a question I get asked all the time. So reasonable adjustments, what do tribunals actually expect? So the duty to make reasonable adjustments is proactive, and it's on the employer to make the duty. If the duty is triggered, so if we have got a physical barrier in the workplace, if we've got a PCP or someone who requires auxiliary aids and it causes a detriment, that duty is then triggered. It's not on the employee to be telling us, oh, here are some reasonable adjustments, or taking the proactive step here. It needs to be the employer, which is another key point of failure that I often see. And reasonable adjustments aren't just a shopping list of things that an employee wants. These need to be things that are actually going to either mitigate or remove that detriment that we've identified. So if we take the example of an absence management policy where we've identified that as a PCP, it's a neutral thing applied across the workforce, where you've got someone who is disabled and off on long-term sickness, they are more likely to trigger those serious stages and more likely to have their employment at risk. That's the detriment. How do we level that playing field? Well, we extend the triggers, or we delay how long it takes before we implement that policy. Or we consider whether in those final stages, whether we delay dismissal or look at alternatives. So it needs to be something that actually addresses that difficulty or the detriment. So things like phased returns, adjusted duties, redeployment, trial periods, these are all popular ones. But the key thing here is we need to consult with the employee. We need to be taking medical evidence and occupational health reports to see what's actually going to make a difference. Firing off a load of reasonable adjustments that you might have read about on the internet is not going to save you in a tribunal. If a judge asks you, well, why did you implement that reasonable adjustment? And you say, well, I don't know, I saw it in a list online. That's you're not going to win. You are going to lose. It needs to be, well, the employee was struggling in this way. This was the detriment I identified, and I genuinely thought that this reasonable adjustment would help in that situation. It needs that level of analysis with it. So frequent short-term absences, when does it become a capability point? So hopefully in your policies, you will have trigger points within there. So we need to establish our trigger points. Once they are triggered, we then investigate, check underlying cause, make sure that we haven't got any disabilities that are rumbling under the surface that we're not aware of, or perhaps that there's something else going on in work. Is someone being bullied? Are there health and safety concerns? Are there other things going on? We issue warnings, consider medical referral if needed, before we move down the stages towards dismissal. Of all the processes, this is the one that probably looks the most like disciplinary. But it's important that we have got those breaks built in case we find something like a disability or something or bullying. Now, the Bradford factor, so a bit of a warning here if you do use the Bradford factor, that isn't a legal test, it's a management indicator. So just because someone's hit a trigger doesn't mean, oh, that's it, the Bradford factor says it's okay to dismiss you. It's really, really important that we are, again, still investigating, looking at underlying concerns and make sure that we are applying that reasonably. Where it's skills and performance, so building a defensible process, it's really, really important that we identify and document the shortfall. There's nothing I hate more than a client coming to me with someone who is at this point of dismissal and asking if it's safe dismissal at that point. And when I look through the documentation, every appraisal that they have had has been a positive appraisal. They've had all of their pay rises. There's been absolutely no issues identified until someone's been put on a formal PIP, not even informal warnings. There's nothing on their file. So I know we all hate difficult conversations, but it's really, really important that that early story is told through an audit trail. So identify and document any shortfalls. Make sure we deal with informal stages first. We don't just launch straight into a PIP. issue the PIP and make sure it's well constructed, that it's achievable, and we're using realistic timescales. So make sure you're going through those SMART objectives. Make sure that there's regular reviews. We don't just set someone off on a PIP for 12 weeks and just pick it up at the end. We need to be checking in with people either weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly, and then make sure at the end that there is a formal capability hearing and an appeal built in as well. Performance improvement plans, genuine versus managing out. So I touched on this earlier. So a defensible PIP should have SMART, measurable objectives, not vague standards, have realistic timescales, should be specific with agreed support, training, mentoring, coaching. Remember, we're trying to help somebody to improve. We need to have regular documented reviews. Evidence that the manager was rooting for the employee to succeed is always a good one. Genuine acknowledgement of any improvements that's made. We don't only focus on the negatives, and make sure we're doing that disability check. So if we think we need an occupational health report, if we're worried about someone, if we think their welfare might be at risk, make sure that we don't forget that. Managing out is where we see objectives that are set so high that they're obviously designed for somebody to fail. Support that's promised but never delivered. Reviews that are a mere formality, so the outcomes are predetermined and they focus very much on the negatives. Managers' language in emails refers to a deal that has already been done, and that a dismissal decision has essentially already been made. It's just a tick box exercise, and that we haven't been proactive around disability or mental health issues. So a tribunal red flag, and I do see this all the time, is WhatsApp messages where we're talking about things like we need to build a case or this person's got to go. They would be disclosable if a subject access request was made. So there's some case studies. We're not going to have time to get through all of them. So I'm just going to pick a couple of good ones. And then when we send out the email and the follow-up, these are some good ones for you to have a look through yourselves. So in this one, touching on the PIP, so the PIP that was never meant to work. So a regional sales manager on a 2-year service was placed on a 4-week PIP after missing targets for 1 quarter. So good service up till then, and it's only been 1 bad quarter. Objectives were set at 120% of the previous quarter's figures. So this person's already done badly in the previous quarter. Now to increase the targets from that, clearly it's not going to go very well. They were promised weekly coaching sessions that were cancelled 4 times. The manager was dismissed at the end of the PIP and with a letter drafted before the final review meeting had took place. So hopefully it's really obvious what went wrong here. The PIP timescale was unreasonable. It was too short for a senior role. 4 weeks to reverse an entire quarter's performance is not going to be enough. The objectives were set to fail. So he'd already failed in the previous quarter and now had less time to hit even more stringent targets. The support was never honoured, and the dismissal letter was pre-drafted. The employee also raised a disability argument. So they had ADHD, which was disclosed during the PIP, which the employee did nothing with. Reasonable adjustments weren't considered, and the employer goes down for unfair dismissal and disability discrimination. As I say, we're not going to have time to get through all of the scenarios, so I will leave these with some notes in the follow-up. So if you do have any questions on those, please don't hesitate to get in touch. I'm more than happy to go through any of these with you after the session. So your 6 golden rules for capability dismissal. So every defensible capability dismissal, whether ill health, disability rated, or performance, comes back to these 6 key principles. If you miss any one of them, and then you are essentially handing the employee a tribunal argument. Get medical evidence. So a GP note is a starting point. It's not a conclusion. Always commission an occupational health report with targeted questions before any capability decision. If you've got an employee who won't give you access to the GP records and refuses to go see occupational health, that does actually make things a little bit easier. You should give them a second or potentially third chance to say, look, we can only make these decisions based on the information that we have available. And what we are trying to do is trying to support you. We're trying to get to the bottom of this, trying to work out what reasonable adjustments we can give you. But ultimately, if they don't cooperate, you can make that decision in that vacuum, and it's likely to potentially mean that it all happens a little bit quicker. Consult genuinely. So this is not tick box meetings. These are real conversations trying to understand what's going on with this employee. Make sure they understand the situation, the timeline, and potential consequences, and document absolutely everything. Always consider adjustments, even if you don't think they meet the test for disability under the Equality Act. Make sure we explore alternatives, follow a fair process, and document absolutely everything. So I'm just going to have a quick look at some of the questions that have come in. So if someone starts a PIP and then partway through expresses they've got mental health pressures, so we've kind of touched on that one, that we should be making sure that if we're not pausing a process, at the very least we're extending it and we're looking at how we can support them. Had a poor performer, kept extending probation, did finally sign off, now continuously sick. Have already done reasonable adjustments in occupational health when started. Now, having been absent, is now getting sick pay, so unsure which way to proceed. So if we've got someone who has poor performance, we've extended the probation, and now off on long-term sick, and we've looked at reasonable adjustments. I mean, that sounds like it's screaming out for a capability process. So that one I would be looking at putting through a formal capability process and looking at seeing whether there is any realistic chance of that person coming back, and if they did, whether they'd actually be capable of performing their role. What should you do if they ask for no contact and don't wish to have any meetings with their line manager or HR on a phased return to work because it stresses them out? So if you've got someone who doesn't want company updates, they don't want to be contacted at all about work, I would at very least put in writing to them, say, look, the benefits of you having this information is that it means that we can keep you up to date on what's going on at work. It's not going to all come as a surprise. But ultimately, saying absolutely no contact and can't be invited to, say, for example, performance meetings, absence meeting, welfare meetings, is something I'd be pushing back on and looking at a referral to occupational health to say, look, is this actually going to make this person worse? And how else can we work around this? So it could be that actually we contact a partner to say, here's a meeting that they need to attend. We need you to communicate this to them, rather than just no contact at all, because it's totally unreasonable to expect that we can't take someone through a management process. And if someone is so ill that we can't communicate with them at all, we can't even invite them, say, for example, to an absence review meeting, I'd be looking at whether that person can actually be managed, and we could potentially be looking at SOSR, which is what we'll discuss in one of the later sessions. Do you have any guidance on how absence triggers should be adjusted? I appreciate it's very case by case, but often struggle on how to advise managers on this. So particularly triggers, it is one of those that depends. The Bradford factor people do find very useful, but actually if you have a policy, Mel, that you'd like me to have a look at, and we can talk about this and see what suits the business, I'd be happy to do that on a no obligation basis. So I think we've got one more. We have occurrences of staff being off sick for a full 6 months to max out their OSP. If we have an occupational health report confirming the employee will be able to return to work if adjustments are put in place or an issue resolved. If we feel we've already implemented adjustments that are reasonable to us, would dismissal still pose a risk? So dismissal always poses a risk when it comes to ill health, but where you have implemented adjustments and you have followed a fair process, you've continued with that medical investigation, and then you reach the point where you have a genuine belief that this person is not capable of fulfilling the role or not capable of coming back within a reasonable time period, the risk is lower. Where people have been pinged in tribunal is where someone is likely to come back within the near to mid-term future, and a tribunal has said it was unreasonable for them not to wait. So it's really important to make sure that we don't just go, well, we've done a process, we've got occupational health, that's it. We need to make sure that we are still engaging with that employee, because if there is a chance that they might return, then and depending on the timescales, then it's important that that's taken into consideration. Yes, we will be circulating the slides. Can a 12-week PIP be built around the 3 stages of dismissal process? If not, improvement is made, i.e. 4-week review, first warning, 8-week review. Okay, yeah, you can, but what I would say is be prepared to have an element of flexibility, because it doesn't necessarily suit every role or every circumstance of underperformance. So where you've got someone who's not hitting sales targets versus someone who actually has some core skills they need to develop, they might need to be on a course, they might need some coaching, it might be that that does need a little bit more flexibility. Should first hearing be held after the PIP? Again, it depends on how your policy structured it. So often I do see that. So it's PIP will run, first hearing, and then PIP goes again. So again, if you want us to look at the policy for you, then we can do. So I think that's as many questions as I've been able to get through. Oh, actually, there's one more. So should we get an occupational health report for someone who has dyslexia, may have ADHD, but no diagnosis, isn't performing, going on a PIP, but he hasn't been absent? I would offer to refer that person to occupational health for sure. Dyslexia, and where someone is either undiagnosed for ADHD or going through that process, those can be very complex cases. So I would be proactive in that, and at the very least offer the employee that referral. And then see where you go from there. So sorry that we've run over. I have tried to get to every question. If I've missed your question, you're always welcome to email me. Hopefully it's been a good session for you. We have got through a huge amount in half an hour, so I'm sorry it's been very, very fast. I hear you can slow me down on YouTube though, so feel free to knock the speed down so that you, it can be absorbed a bit better. And yes, the slides will be circulated afterwards. Please don't hesitate to sign up for the redundancy session as well, that will be in a couple of weeks. And as we move through this masterclass, it's been really popular. So it's great to see so many of you coming on week after week. If you have got any feedback for us, please do email them over to us. And we look forward to seeing you on the next session. Thank you so much. And we'll see you in a couple of weeks.